And we're going to get right into it this half hour. Our guest is Warren Kniskern. He's an attorney from Coral Gables, just outside of Miami, and he is coming out with a book called Courting Disaster. It'll be in your Christian bookstore shelves within a week or two, Warren.
Sure.
And before the break, we were just getting into the subject of how litigious American society is. Are we the most litigious country in the world today?
I think so. But the fact is, the National Center for State Courts keeps statistics of how many cases are coursing through our state court system, starting in 1984. And in 1990, they tabulated that there were 100 million new cases filed in state courts in that 1 year alone.
That's one for every other adult in America.
Yes, or even more. And then the next year it went down slightly to 93 million cases, new cases. And the National Center for State Courts says that we are getting overloaded. They are getting more new cases in. They're not weeding the old cases out. And they said by the end of the decade, we're going to have a major problem. Of course, those who have been in the courts know that they don't need the National Center to say that. They know it's a problem because it takes so long to get justice done.
What is it about our society that breeds litigation? Is it the inherent byproduct of the freedoms that we are assigned in the Constitution?
I really believe it's the basic problem is that people are just not talking to each other. It used to be, Lee Iacocca in his book, Talking Straight, said that in the past, when someone's apples fell in your yard, you worked it out over the backyard fence or you made pies, but today you sue. It's really becoming more estranged from each other. We're becoming less of a nation of neighbors and becoming strangers. So it's a lot easier to litigate with someone you don't really know than with someone you have a friendship with, someone in the church or a close neighbor that you have a relationship with.
Reminds you of the Abraham Lincoln saying regarding his enemy. He said, how can he be my enemy if I make him my friend?
That's right.
You know, if we endeavor to make friends out of those who are hostile to us, we end up heaping burning coals of fire upon their head, but we won't sue them.
That's right. Am I not destroying my enemy by making them my friends?
Right.
Very well put.
You liken this to the China syndrome. Do you think we're going to reach some kind of boiling point here that we can't recover from and a collapse of our court system if it keeps on the same path?
There is the risk of that happening, but I think before that actually does happen, either one of two things are going to occur. One is they're going to start turning cases away because they can't keep up with the flow. Now, they can't turn away criminal cases. They've always got to handle those. But the civil cases are either going to get more and more backlogged, where, for example, if someone is going through a divorce, you want to get that over as quickly as possible and not drag it out. But people that are in divorce litigation may find that their trial would be set 1, 2, 3 years down the line, so it's just an enormous emotional bondage to wait for that to happen. Or they will have to raise taxes, something that everyone likes to hear, to hire more judges, build more courthouses, and keep the system going. Right now, we're closing in on $100 billion a year to fund the state, local, and federal court system. The federal court system alone is closing in on $4 billion each year. It's an enormous expense.
Aren't there some things, though, that couldn't be legislated, or could be legislated, limits on some tort reform, some limits on product injury cases? I mean, we all know the case where a woman spilled coffee and was awarded $4 million. Things like that grab the headlines, but also kind of grabs people's attention. Well, if I've been hurt, I have my rights, and I'm going to go collect what's due me.
Yes. Well, the saying is, Jim, that today, with so many people having a victim mindset and saying that I'm not to blame, when anything happens, two things are going to happen. Number one, someone else is at fault, and number two, someone else is going to pay. We've become very greedy and very selfish in that respect a lot of times. Not to say that they're all like that. But
are we in need of a mindset change then, that some things are not somebody's fault? Some things are either an act of God or accidents do happen?
Sure.
And we have to pick up ourselves from the bootstraps and go on.
I think that's very well put, Jim. Some things are just unavoidable. And we don't necessarily have to require other people to pay for things that happen that, are just circumstance or coincidence. But unfortunately, everybody's trying to hit the jackpot, the lottery, thinking that they can get it out of an insurance company or out of a rich defendant to compensate you so you'll never have to work again. It goes well beyond the scope of the action or injury involved.
Can you make any generalizations that a Christian should never sue for anything?
Some people feel that way. I think it's going a little too far. I can think of instances where it would be appropriate to sue. If, for example, if you were in a domestic violence situation, you would want to go through the legal processes to have the protection that the law provides. But there are other instances where it would be best to look, just ignore a minor defense, as Proverbs says, and to move on instead of having people pay for it.
We're going to move on to some of the biblical principles that Christ and the Apostle Paul have given us. But first, let's take a call from Brian in Pompano Beach. Brian, welcome to Worship Live.
How you doing tonight?
Oh, we're doing fine. And do you have a question for Warren?
Yes, I do. My question is, if the law, basically all law, especially in America, was God-given, and why should not Christians avail themselves of the protection of that law, even to the point of suing somebody to collect damages that were done? Now, I realize there's a lot of abuse in that, but I think the abuse comes from, especially in our society, from a lot of greedy lawyers that promote that. No offense there, but, that's what I think this whole scheme is. And the idea is retribution, paying for damages that were done. I think that's scriptural.
Warren, let's start off by saying, is all law God-given? We have Romans 13, which we are to be subject to the laws of the land. There are certainly some God did have laws in the Ten Commandments and other laws as reflected in the Old Testament. Are all laws God-given?
I don't know that is, I think that's going a little too far, maybe too broad. If you're talking about a lawsuit between Christians, then we know what God says about that from 1 Corinthians 6. He says, don't go to law against one another, but resolve it in the church. And Paul is very strong in the statements that he makes. How dare you sue your brother? And this in front of unbelievers. So in terms of Christians having a dispute with each other, God has already told us where we need to go, and it's not to the civil courts of men.
What about in suits against society or against religious liberty types of suits? Should Christians avoid those?
Well, I think that sometimes you can avoid those, but this is another area where I think mediation would be very helpful, because in religious freedom and religious liberty areas, there's a lot of confusion, and people are turning the screws on Christians in their religious beliefs and expressing those beliefs because they just don't understand what the laws are. What a wonderful opportunity to bring people together in a room and say, this is what the law is. The Christian Legal Society does that, and say, this is what the law says you can do and this is what you can't do. I think there's a lot of room for compromise in there.
Aren't we going to be working yourself out of a job here if we follow your advice?
It's interesting you say that, Jim, because there's more than a few attorneys that are going to be unhappy with this book. But again, I'm not saying we should never sue and we should never go to court, because there are circumstances like that come up. What I am saying is that there are a lot of suits that are unnecessary. There are a lot of suits that are frivolous. There are a lot of suits where people are just being greedy. And we need to work out some of these problems and take some of the pressure off our courts through meeting face to face, to talking with one another, to putting the facts on the table, laying your cards on the table, and working it out peacefully in a neutral environment.
Brian, I hope that answered some of your questions.
Well, it does somewhat. I agree with what he said about what he quoted about Corinthians. But what about the idea of retribution, a criminal paying back the damages that he's done? Isn't that biblical? Well,
I think you said at the outset, Warren, that we'll always have criminal cases.
Yes. If you're talking about restitution, restitution is a legal transaction. As I read the New Testament, there's a lot of room for love and grace and mercy and forgiveness. And when you're using biblical forgiveness in a situation, the legal scales of justice won't always balance, which is all right. God has been very merciful to me and to us And if someone is going to take advantage of me in order to have peace and to allow the Lord to have vengeance in the situation rather than me taking vengeance, sometimes you let things go.
And again, Romans says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord."
Romans 12 says that, right?
So, what are some of the biblical principles upon which your book is based? I know you refer to a portion of the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes. I think Matthew 5, for those who are wanting to know how to resolve conflicts, Matthew 5 is a treasure trove of advice from the Lord. Matthew 5:8 says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Why? Because they will be called sons of God. We're never more like Jesus than when we're trying to make peace with our neighbor and our brother.
And you ask the big question, where are all the peacemakers today?
That's right. There are a lot of people that are just standing by. You know, that came up in my own congregation some years ago. We were fussing and fighting and having a big dispute, and there were factions and division in the church, and we called in a former minister to come in and help us to resolve the dispute. And the first thing he said when he got up before the crowd was, "Where are the peacemakers in this church?" And that just cut me. I mean, that really went right to the heart, because he was absolutely right. Every one of us has it in us to be a peacemaker. There are people that get embroiled in a dispute and need the input of someone who is neutral to come in and say, let's work this out together, let's cooperate. It's not you have the problem or I have the problem, but we have a problem between us, and let's put our heads together and try to work out some options.
And then didn't Jesus give us a step-by-step process in how to do this in Matthew 18?
Yes. Well, Matthew 5, verses 23 through 26 says that if you know someone has something against you, even in the middle of worship, you're to leave as a matter of urgency and go to that person and be reconciled, then come back to worship. In Matthew 18, it's the other side of it, where someone has offended you. If someone sins against you, you go to that person. Now, ideally, if the offended and the offender are both going to each other, they're going to meet each other on the way. Mm-hmm. And what does Jesus do? He says we need to work this out face to face, privately. Now, there's a lot of people that just ignore that. They want to talk to other people, or in a church situation, they'll say, let's pray for Sam or Donna before I talk to her because she's doing this or he's doing that. Totally wrong. I mean, Jesus says, go privately to your brother or sister and work it out. And then if you can't work it out, to get 2 or 3 others to bring them along. Matthew 18 goes into the step. And then if that is not able to, if there's no reconciliation that occurs, then you bring it to the church.
Don't you think a lot of the talk, you say people don't want to confront one another, so they talk to their buddy, the person in the pew next to them, and James tells us it can be like a forest fire when these comments, these accusations and counter-accusations get flying around a congregation. It can destroy a church, it can split a church, and has.
That's
in
right.
Many instances.
Tongue is a raging fire. James put it exactly right. But the common element in Matthew 18 through all the steps that are mentioned there is whether someone will listen. Every one of us wants to be heard. And again, what I said at the outset is a lot of the litigation that we have in our courts and more to come is the result of people just not talking with each other.
And what does that litigation do for a Christian witness? Have you seen, you've hung around courthouses before, do the Christians then become a subject of derision in the world for bringing some of these lawsuits out in public? And
I think, unfortunately, Jim, I think we've already passed the point of sensitivity on that. It's just become so commonplace that people don't even think about it anymore. But we do have an opportunity to reverse this tide. And that is when someone's in litigation, as I was in my divorce. I was sued by my ex-wife. I think this is an opportunity for us to exercise grace and mercy, to act lovingly, to try and settle it. I think the principle Christians ought to keep in mind is it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong in trying to resolve some of these disputes. Because if we fall into the hands of men, they are not going to understand what's going on. They won't understand the spiritual principles that we know from God's Word.